and this is the Pretender that we will be taking into Fullest House, first edition. I'll be the first to admit that this is a very meta and boring pick. The Frostfather is a very common rainbow because he starts off having skills in 2 different magic paths. So assuming that you're interested in, an air bless or air paths and water bless or water paths, often ends up being cheaper than a lot of other alternatives. Didn't really have a huge plan for Vaettiheim here. Really the main thing that I'm looking for out of this Pretender is the ability to both, cast Illwinter and cast Winter's Call, which will allow us to bring in the Neefel Jarls, as well as having a, decent bless for them and scales that I felt were acceptable. So we will require a little bit of boosting in order to cast those spells, but not too much, and those aren't really like early or probably even mid-game things. Certainly, since those spells are at Blood 6, you could arguably put up Illwinter in the mid-game, but especially in a large game like this, it's a hostile global, so it will draw a lot of aggro. So I personally feel that generally you need to be fairly well established before you cast that spell, even if you're able to cast it earlier. So the water pathing and blood pathing are more or less dictated by those spells, the need to cast those spells. The rest of it is dictated by what I wanted on the bless. So I guess let's talk bless first. We had the blood pathing. We could put strength on. I think the Rimvetti absolutely would want strength, but strength is going to be useless for your sacred mages and isn't all that necessary for Neefel Jarls. So I do feel like Blood Surge is probably a better pick here. It does mean that I think your Rimvetti will be less effective in some scenarios. Blood Surge doesn't always trigger, and if you have a low strength, you may not get the kill, even against enemies that normally would trigger Blood Surge. So Blood Surge, I think, can be a win more sort of situation. And while your mages absolutely can get kills, you're not exactly an evocation powerhouse, so your mages aren't going to be getting direct kills to trigger that Blood Surge as often as some other nations. So, certainly I could see trying to do something different with this, but the main other thing that you do with Blood that's not incarnate, I do think Blood Vengeance would be interesting, but you would have to make a lot of sacrifices in your scales. We'll talk about the scales later. But the other main non-incarnate thing that you do with Blood is strength. And like I said, not that useful for 2 out of the 3 sacred units that you're going to be utilizing. And it's kind of a similar story for our Water Bless points. So we've gone with defense skill. That's going to help the Rimvetti, and it's going to help the Neefel Jarls, but not really going to help the mages. So a little bit of loss there. Obviously, cold resistance isn't all that useful. Your units already have pretty significant cold resistance, especially your sacreds. I do think there's probably something to be said, especially for your sacred Vetti mages. If you're going to be going cold 3 like we have, they do have cold resistance, but they don't have a lot of hit points. So, they wouldn't hate more cold resistance, but I do think the defense skill is, more worthwhile because the Rimvetti and the Neefel Jarls definitely do not need any more cold resistance. So those were bless elements that we were sort of, forced into. We were going to have, these bless points regardless because we needed these paths to cast spells. The rest of it is definitely by choice. I think probably the most important of that choice is the poison resistance because you're definitely a nation that can cast Foul Vapors. I think that enchantment is where Foul Vapors comes from, enchantment 5. You could certainly make a research target of that, but I don't think that that's probably Vaettiheim's best first target. I don't know. Hard to say, actually, because you are a decent Skelly spam nation. So I take that back. You certainly could choose to go enchantment first, and for Foul Vapors, and all the more reason that you would want to go full poison resistance. But I think, even if you're not targeting enchantment first, since you are a nation that can cast Foul Vapors, and it's very common anyway, just out and about from other people, poison resistance always useful, but kind of, I don't want to say a must for Vaettiheim, but it's a very strong consideration. Also, with the remainder of our Nature Bless points, went with Low Light Vision. You don't have any kind of Dark Vision on Vaettiheim, but you do have a lot of Death Magic, right? So later in the game, darkness is definitely something you can think about. You don't have super high def, but, with a Sabbath or a communion, you can definitely put up darkness. So, adding some sort of vision onto your sacreds, I think, is going to be pretty useful. The fire and the shock resistance, fairly self-explanatory. Evocations are definitely a problem for your Veti, and the Jarls actually get a shock malice, right, because they're part of the Jotuns. So trying to cover that hole, I think, is pretty important for the Nephil Jarls. The Rim Veti are really going to like it. Your Sacred Mages are going to like it. It's an uncontroversial and strong pick. Really, the only thing is, maybe you want some more skills, right? In which case you can, ditch the fire resistance and air resistance or shock resistance from these paths and switch it over to Earth, which is definitely more cost effective. But of course, the Earth one is incarnate, so going imprisoned, I think that's too risky. You'd probably have to go dormant and then maybe make some sacrifices in the scales or some sacrifices elsewhere in the bless. So anyway, resistance is very relevant. I do think it's a strong consideration on Vaettiheim. The Earth part of the bless here, again, this is recorded after the fact, so this is with the benefit of hindsight and some more knowledge. The reinvigoration is definitely useful on the Nephil Jarls. I think reinvigoration is most useful on thugs. At the time, I was valuing it on the Sacred Mages as well, but, looking at it, like, the amount of fatigue you're going to be getting from casting spells versus the amount that you're going to be recovering from a little bit of extra reinvigoration, it's pretty marginal. And the Rim Veti, they don't have a particularly high encumbrance. They certainly won't. No one's going to mind the reinvigoration, but I don't really know if this is worth the points. I will say that, Vaettiheim is a nation that really kind of wants Earth and doesn't have it. So, putting some Earth on your Pretender to help break you into Earth, I think is something of a consideration. But ultimately, if you don't find any independents that have Earth, having it only on your Pretender, it's going to be pretty difficult to break yourself into a way that's going to be really useful. Because, you're going to want, like, Earth Mages in every army to cast really mostly, I think, Strength of Giants. Though certainly no one minds Legions of Steel either. Obviously, your Pretender can only be in one place, so, it's a little useful, right? If you have a pivotal battle, you can bring your Pretender, get some Strength of Giants out, but ultimately, your Pretender probably should be doing more important things than casting Strength of Giants on one army. But like I said, definitely the Nephil Jarls are going to like the reinvigoration a lot, so, if you can spare it, right, like if you can fit it in, I don't think it's terrible, but certainly if there was one thing I was going to cut from this bless, it would be the Earth. And that covers the bless, not terrible, but nothing too exciting here. Like I said, partially driven by the spells that we want to cast, also partially driven by the scales that we want, so let's talk scales next. We've gone full order. I think that this is a very strong consideration for Vaettiheim. You certainly don't have to go full order, but I do think that a lot of your best units, want a lot of recruitment points. Having played through this game, there was definitely points where, even with my full order scales in, it's like, man, recruitment points were the limiting factor for some of the units that I was trying to recruit. So it's like, if I could have gone up to 4 order, probably would have done it, or at least considered it. But of course, you cannot. So anyway, we've gone full order. I do recommend it. I think at least a little order is in order for Vaettiheim. We've gone neutral production. I do think production is probably a scale you could get away with dumping a little bit more than this if you wanted to. Though definitely, some of your better units start to need more resources, and I'm not sure what this would do to your expansion, right? Like really, you'd need to test the expansion, particularly. I did Wolf Brother expansion, and I think if you go any lower than this, it gets significantly more difficult, right? You're just going to have fewer units to get out. So if there's a different way that you can expand, maybe with the Rim Veti, right? If you have an even stronger bless for the Rim Veti specifically, then you might be able to get away with dumping this a little bit more, and then, just relying on small groups of your sacreds to expand. We've gone Cold 3. Cold 2 is our preference, but I think Cold 3, like, you have so much stuff that really, like, wants cold and prefers cold, and you have snow move on everything. Like, I think Cold 3 is a pretty strong consideration. Yeah, I don't think going cold 2 is crazy. If you really want to go for kind of more of a scales build, I think you'd have a really hard time justifying heat Vaettiheim. So, hey, if you can pull it off, go for it. But I recommend cold 3. Growth 3, I don't think this is required, but, this is a full house game. So the expectation is that it will go long. It's a lot of players in it. And large games is really where growth shines. So I will say that you are a blood nation, and blood has ways to boost the growth scales of specific provinces. So if you want to do that, I think you can certainly get away with a lower growth scale. Though I will say that late age has the most population, so in a lot of ways, late age is the place where maximum growth is strongest. So anyway, since I'm no expert in blood, and there's more micro related to using blood to boost up your growth scales, and it does cost blood slaves. So, and again, not an expert in blood, I figured I better stick with growth 3. But certainly not a requirement for Vaettiheim. Also not a requirement for Vaettiheim, so we got full misfortune 3, right? Got to get those free points. Yeah, this is one of those divisive ones. Some people swear by it. Some people, say don't ever do it. I will say that overall, the order 3 and the misfortune 3 is definitely synergistic. We're going to get less events since we have full order scales. We also have relatively nice scales other than our misfortune, right? Misfortune tends to get a lot worse, right, if you combine it with some other nasty scales. So I think going misfortune 3 is never completely responsible, but this is probably on the more responsible side of misfortune 3. So anyway, we'll see how that works out. And then, of course, we've got Magic 3. I do think, Magic scales on Vaettiheim, strong consideration. You're going to be recruiting a lot of mages, especially with the Vaetti Hags. The Magic 3 just, speeds your research a lot. I think Magic scales are really almost always a consideration. I have definitely been won over to Magic scales now. I, really try to get some Magic scales into as many builds as possible. I will say giant nations, right? Nations where you have fewer mages, it's significantly less powerful. So I think it's more reasonable to not have Magic on those nations. But even on those nations, faster research is very powerful. So anyway, we're planning on having a lot of mages. We're going Magic 3. And then, Dominion strength is 6. I like to have kind of, at least medium or, medium strong Dominion. It is definitely a preference thing. You certainly could go lower Dominion, though I will say that Rimvetti are good, right? And this is going to limit the recruitment, of your sacreds. So I wanted to recruit a good amount of Rimvetti. So, I was going to need at least decent Dominion strength. And then it just helps, with, again, a lot of your units like that cold. But if you're really struggling to push out your Dominion and, you're bordering some heat people, and certainly plenty of nations in the late age are going to be taking heat, you're going to be at a somewhat serious disadvantage, especially with the Rimvetti, especially with the Neefel Jarls, and to a lesser extent your other troops, right? Again, you have snow move and cold resistance and a lot of water magic. So yeah, Vaettiheim definitely I think plays better when it's cold, and you're going to struggle to make more of the map cold if you have weak scales. If you have weak Dominion strength. So that covers the build that we went with. I don't want to dive too deeply into other options for Vaettiheim, but these are the possible pretender chassis that they have available. I will say that the blood and water combination is pretty rare. In fact, I don't think any of these pretender chassis actually just have that out of the gate. And that's another reason that a rainbow is attractive. So, going with a rainbow is going to be the cheapest way to allow your pretender to cast those 2 spells, Illwinter and Winter's Call. Certainly, the Frostfather is not the only one that could, you could put it on. You could put it on any rainbow relatively cheaply, but water is one of the relevant paths, and of course, all the cold power and chill that the Frostfather has is definitely going to like the cold 3 that you're probably going to be going with Vaettiheim. But other possibilities do exist. The Scrotty is definitely thematic and starts with blood, which is a relevant path. And, you do get a minor discount on it. That 20-point discount, really, most of the discounts aren't that big a deal, but it is something to consider. I'll also say a couple other chassis that I played around with, really just because they're neat, are the Draco Lich and the Bog Mummy, both of which are reduced for the nation. The thing of it is, Vaettiheim doesn't really need an expander. So I do think that these picks are somewhat difficult to justify, but the Draco Lich, that's the thing. The other thing is pretty expensive to add paths to it, and it doesn't have either of the paths that you need to cast those spells, so kind of difficult to justify, but does at least have high death and is very, cool and thematic. But definitely, the reason that I didn't go with it. I think the Bog Mummy is like a little easier to justify. It's got some interesting traits. It is immortal, which is pretty neat. And it does start out with, blood pathing and is a lot less expensive to add paths to. So, this is certainly someone that you could tag Winter's Call and Illwinter onto. Otherwise, I think, a decent pick for Vaettiheim would be a Monolith, like never a bad pick. You'd probably go this route if you're not going to be interested in getting Neefle Jarls. You certainly could add Blood and Water to a Monolith, but that's going to be somewhat expensive. But otherwise, it has, 2 relevant paths for your nation, and I do think that, high astral and high nature on your pretender, I think is pretty reasonable as Vaettiheim, because while you have plenty of both of those paths, really high access is kind of tricky for you to get a hold of. I think particularly if you want to cast Mother Oak early, getting a Nature 5 that's going to come out, at around the dormant time is probably what you're going to be looking at if you don't want to get beat out by other nations. And of course, the Monolith absolutely can be set up for that. The other nice thing about the Monolith is it does have Earth magic. We talked about how getting some Earth, will be nice. Obviously, the Monolith is not going to be casting Strength of Giants on your armies very often since it's immobile, but it can at least, start to site search for you and, help break you into the path. It'll be fairly slow, but it is a consideration. One additional nice thing is it does have the Astral Earth cross path, and since you do have Sabbaths and Communions, the ability to wire in independent mages through Communion matrices is pretty nice. And Earth Astral is not something that you have as Vaettiheim. So Monolith, I think, also a consideration. Fountain of Blood, I think probably also consideration, right? High blood pathing, if you really wanted to go scales, add water to it. It's not that expensive, right? You just want something that's going to come in and cast Illwinter later, and you want to have really nice scales. I think you could probably go with Fountain of Blood. So anyway, a few other thoughts in terms of other pretenders. And finally, to close out our discussion on Vaettiheim in general, I wanted to talk about these 2 spells, Twiceborn and Transformation. They're not national spells, but they are extremely useful to Vaettiheim, so I do think they warrant a little bit of discussion. Both of these are down paths that I think you're going to be wanting to research anyway. Twiceborn you get at Enchantment 4, and you only need Death 2 to cast it. You'll certainly have a lot of Death 2s running around, and you will be making Skull Staffs, so even your mages that aren't Death 2, you hand them a Skull Staff and Twiceborn them. And the really nice thing for Twiceborn and Vaettiheim is that you're size 1, so it is indeed actually only 5 Death Gems. Normally, in-game, this is displayed as, 5 asterisk, and the asterisk is related to the size of the unit. So if you're size 2, it's actually 10 death gems, etc., etc. It's 5 death gems per size point. Now, of course, for your giant mages, it's going to be pretty expensive, but for your Veti mages, it's extremely cheap to be twice-borning them. That by itself is very nice, but it can be combined with Transformation, which is at Alteration 6. Again, I think a path or a school of magic that you're going to want to go down. It only requires Nature 2 to cast, which a lot of your Veti mages are going to be Nature 2, and those that aren't can hold a Thistle Mace. You will probably be making Thistle Maces, so again, this is something that's not out of the way for you. And this transforms your caster into a random monster. Now, this is tied to your luck scales, so normally taking Misfortune and trying to do transformations would not be a good idea. But the good news is that once they've been twice-borned, if they get a really bad result with a transformation, you just get them killed, and then they come back as like a normal white mage. And since it's so easy for you to twice-born, you can essentially get around the downsides of taking Misfortune and doing Transformation. Though certainly, you could go Luck with Vaettiheim, in which case you wouldn't need to worry about it. You'd probably just get some good results. And then the final nice thing about this combo is that if you get I think it's size 4 or above result from your Transformation, then you end up getting a pretty large white mage chassis. So this is kind of a way for you to generate at least heavy thugs and or light super combatants, which of course isn't strictly necessary since you'll be able to generate Nephil Jarls, but this doesn't require blood slaves. So if your blood slaves are being used for something else, or there's only so many Nephil Jarls you're going to be able to get, this is just another way to get some heavy thugs, and also it's probably going to be available to you before the Nephil Jarls are. And before you get the Nephil Jarls, or before you dive deeply into blood, you don't really have any great thug chassis. So neither of these are national spells, but I think both of them very relevant to Vaettiheim. So that more or less covers the plan that I had for Vaettiheim. Really, like the long range plan was to cast Illwinter, get those Nephil Jarls in. The short range plan is to go down Alteration, but not so much, definitely had Transformation in mind. But more was interested in the point buffing spells. So really, for our first war, we're going to be aiming more at things like Luck and Moss Body and Protection and a lot of low-level stuff like that, most of which you get by Alteration 4. So that's the plan for Vaettiheim for Fullest House First Edition, and we'll start the game next week.